On the screen, as you notice there at the end of our greeting time, are some of these 6-word memoirs that many of you have submitted. We're inviting you to think of these as tiny testimonies. And if you haven't yet, we invite you to write one of your own, and you could submit it if you want. During the Lenten season, we're taking a fresh look at our lives as road less traveled stories. Here at Second, we try our best to avoid talking about faith as a one-size-fits-all experience. We're trying not to create an environment with this some kind of built-in assumption that following Jesus always looks the same for everyone. Now, it's true, and this is good news, I think, it's true that God's goodness meets us wherever we are. But God's love always meets us in ways that are appropriate to who we are, where we are, what we've experienced, and what we're ready for next. And that's a good thing. In last week's sermon, I suggested that we can welcome Jesus' call to discipleship, this invitation to learn and take up his way of life. We can welcome that as a kind of grand, nonconformist adventure. A call to an interesting, non-obvious way of life. Jesus invites us to loosen our grip on any demand for an easy, stress-free life so that we can take up our cross. In that sense, Jesus invites us to take up a life that's capable of being surprised, capable of remaining flexible, vulnerable, caring, and connected to other people. And also last week, Debbie Farrell shared with us her road less traveled story about a midlife shift from mechanical engineer to commissioned lay pastor. And this morning, in just a little bit, you'll get to hear from Alex Treaster. And I encourage you to listen for wisdom and for inspiration from all these different stories that you'll hear during the Lenten season. Of course, we borrowed the language for this sermon series from Robert Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken, a poem that invites us to imagine our lives as a series of important fork-in-the-road decisions, choices. The poem invites us to stay awake to all the different intersections of our lives, so don't fall asleep. Don't walk right past a threshold that might open out onto something new. In the poem's language, way always leads on to way, and we might never find ourselves again at quite this particular fork in the road with quite these same possible paths before us. So choose your path well and wisely, the poet advises. Acknowledge the preciousness of each day. Honor the sacredness built into all the ways our choosings form and transform us. Both Frost's poem and Jesus' call to discipleship imagine moments of discernment and decision-making. But sometimes we find ourselves on roads less traveled not by choice, but by circumstances we didn't choose and never would have chosen. So this week, the second week of Lent, I want to move us in a slightly different direction. I want us to reflect together on the paths we didn't choose. The paths that got thrust upon us, the paths we never wanted to travel but need to learn to navigate nonetheless. Consider, for example, what happened here in Kansas City over the last couple of weeks, the joy of a Super Bowl win, followed by the celebratory parade, thousands of people coming together to mark a festive occasion. I started to say once in a lifetime. But it's several times in a lifetime, and maybe there will be more. And then, of course, the shooting. And in the wake of that terrible tragedy, the family and friends of Lisa Lopez Galvin are forced to deal with the loss of someone they loved. Dozens of others have to deal with the injuries from that shooting and the psychological trauma of being there. Thousands of other bystanders, along with all the rest of us, now live shaken, wondering whether it's ever safe again to gather in large numbers. Now, you know all of this. You lived through it just like I did. I'm simply pointing out the obvious, that life is as much about what happens to us as it is about what we choose or decide. Or put differently, Much of our choosing is a choosing about how to respond to situations we never would have chosen. Now, from that particular frame, expand out, broaden it just a little bit, and think about all the circumstances that people have to deal with. One of the wonderful things about being a pastor is that as I look out, I see so many people who parts of your stories you've shared with me. I know I don't know all the stories, and I certainly won't name them all this morning, but this great variety of all the ways we have to deal with what life brings us. But think globally a little bit. Millions of people around the world face dangerous weather patterns, and some have become climate refugees. Millions of other people have been forced into exile and migration due to a whole bunch of different factors: violence or instability, persecution, famine, or poverty. Consider all the more personal and pedestrian, but still powerful ways that change happens in our lives, change we didn't invite or want. A diagnosis shifts everything. A new limitation or physical challenge makes our previous plans for the future impossible. We lose someone before we were ready to say goodbye. A once steady job disappears. A child or a parent or a friend needs a level of care that calls for great sacrifice and disrupts our regular routine. So when we talk about roads less traveled, it's important to recognize that life is comprised not just of what we do or what we choose, but of what happens to us and how we handle it. Israel's theologians and storytellers had a keen sense of the pain of difficult circumstances, the pain of exile and homesickness. Deep in Israel's shared experience was the recognition that life can go off the rails due to circumstances beyond our control. So Israel told these stories of collective exile, for example, as when they were invaded, conquered, and then deported by distant empires like Babylon. Psalm 137 gives expression to the pain and confusion of such large-scale, life-altering disasters. Listen to just how it begins. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and there we wept when we remembered Zion. That's poetic language for Jerusalem, their homeland, what's familiar, what they're missing. On the willows there in Babylon, we hung our harps. For there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of your homeland." But how could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? The music of life is gone because something so powerful has happened to them in their exile. The Hebrew Bible is a persuasive story of God's way of being with us because it keeps our hearts, our minds, and our imaginations open to all the large-scale, even geopolitical ways our lives can be shifted into difficulty. That storytelling, that persuasiveness is deepened, I think, even by more personal stories of lives derailed into difficulty. Take, for example, the heart-rending story of Joseph, which we'll read in just a moment. Before we hear a bit of Joseph's story, you should know a couple of things about his situation. It's a pretty familiar story, so you may know this. Joseph was born into a complicated, blended family marked by sibling rivalry and jealousy. He didn't exactly help himself in this matter. Joseph was a bit tone deaf when it came to how to read social cues and how to relate to his siblings. So when Joseph had dreams suggesting his eventual rise to importance over the rest of his family, over his brothers, he made the mistake of sharing these dreams excitedly with his brothers, inciting their jealousy further. Even so, even with that faux pas, Joseph couldn't have predicted and certainly didn't deserve what happened to him. So now listen to what happened to him. Friends, listen for God's voice speaking to you in this strange story of hardship and exile from Genesis 37. Now Joseph's brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem, and Israel, that's Jacob's new name, Jacob his father, said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I'll send you to them." He answered, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now, see if it's well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring word back to me." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron. He came to Shechem, and a man found him wandering in the fields. The man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I'm seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where they're pasturing the flock." The man said, "They've gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from a distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes the dreamer. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we'll say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." A revenge story. But when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, "Let's not take his life." Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him." He did this so that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornamented robe that he wore. They probably shouldn't have worn it. And they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels carrying gum, balm, and resin on their way to carry it down into Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he's our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. When some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they, the Midianites, took Joseph to Egypt. And I'm skipping ahead to the last line in that chapter. And then the Midianites sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. May God bless the reading of Holy Scripture. Thanks be to God. Now, if you take this odd family tragedy from a certain angle, we might be able to discern in Joseph's story a key episode in a much larger story of God's dealings with the people of Israel. After all, in terms of the narrative plot, you need Israel enslaved in Egypt somehow to drive this Exodus story of God liberating Israel from Egypt. And maybe on occasion that's sometimes true for us too, occasionally, not always, but occasionally, and usually only much, much later in our stories, we can sometimes discern that the difficult twists and turns of our lives served some larger purpose or created possibilities that wouldn't otherwise have emerged. But friends, be very, very careful with this way of reading Joseph's stories, your own or anyone else's. If I experience some devastating loss or unexpected change, please, please do not try to cheer me up by telling me that everything's going to be okay, because all of this is part of some larger plan. It might be, or it might not be. So please, just be with me in ways that offer support and give me space to grieve and adjust to what's new. Whatever you do, don't smooth Joseph's story out too much. We know a lot as readers of the story that poor Joseph doesn't know when he's in the middle of it. And so perhaps it will be more helpful to us as we imagine our own roads less traveled to identify with the way the character, the figure of Joseph, has to experience these unfolding events within the framework of the story itself. Now, this is a rich and complex story, and I'm going to admit that for the sake of time, I'm being very selective here. So I draw attention this morning only to one simple aspect of the story. Notice that this is a family story. This is a familiar story of failure within family life. There's lots else going on, but I just want to land here. Growing up in families that didn't provide what we most needed is one of the most basic expressions of circumstances outside our control. Like all young people, Joseph needed safety and security, a way of belonging and being emotionally connected to other people. And yet, Joseph was disappointed when those responsible for supporting his well-being harmed him instead. Those he trusted betrayed him and made his life much more difficult than it needed to be. So here we are. Joseph's living a life he didn't choose. Yes, he rolls with the punches and he survives. And by surviving, yes, his life gradually takes on a new shape and becomes a small part of God's larger way of being good to Israel. And I promise you that God will be good to you too on your road less traveled. I promise you that God will be good to you in the midst of whatever challenges you're facing. I just don't know how or how soon. You may not trust your siblings either, but I hope you're not worried about your siblings murdering you or selling you into slavery to a foreign empire. But I guarantee you that you'll experience some level of disappointment or betrayal by those you needed to love you. I guarantee you that you'll have to adjust to feelings of exile and alienation, a kind of grieving of the sense of home, of safety that you deeply desire. I promise you that at least part of your road less traveled story will be a story about losing your footing, feeling lost and adrift in the face of changes you didn't want, all of which brings me to a poem by David Wagner. The poem is entitled simply Lost, and it goes like this. Stand still. The trees ahead and bushes beside you are not lost. Wherever you are is called here. And you must treat it as a powerful stranger, must ask permission to know it and be known. The forest breathes. Listen. It answers, I have made this place around you. If you leave it, you may come back again, saying, here. No two trees are the same to raven. No two branches are the same to wren. If what a tree or a bush does is lost on you, you are surely lost. Stand still. The forest knows where you are. You must let it find you. I like this poem because it redefines what it means to be lost. And this might be helpful to more than a few of us this morning as we reflect on our own lives, our own Lenten journeys, our own roads less traveled. To be lost, according to this poet, is not simply a matter of being exiled from home. To be lost is not here simply equated with situations where we're pulled off the planned path or blocked from the journey we expected to travel. For Wagner, the poet, to be lost is simply to fail to show up to your life here and now as it actually exists. To be lost is to brush off the only gift of life you have, the imperfect one, unplanned and messy, this deviation or derailment from what you thought your life would be like. Wherever you are is here, says the poet. And you are not lost if you can awaken to life right here where you are, to register the shock and the surprise and the strangeness of all that surrounds you, trees and light and building and weather and people. You are not lost if you can become like raven and wren, refusing to ride roughshod over the delicate texture of life, instead cultivating this wonderful capacity to notice that no two trees are the same, no two branches of those trees are the same. So call off the frantic search for happiness, says the poet. Stand still. Don't lurch into a life constantly running around chasing after this and that. Just be still. Let life come. Listen as goodness rustles. Look on with wonder as simple beauty glimmers in dappled sunlight. Friends, if we can come to see life-altering challenges as part of a normal human life, we can let go of any fantasies we have of controlling how things go, managing all the outcomes. We can actually experience events that knock us off course and knock the wind out of our sails, and still refuse to interpret these challenges as a sign that God is far away or uninterested or unavailable. We can learn to pray as people who've already normalized the life of exile, whether it's that exile is lived literally, as it is for millions of people around the globe, or more metaphorically, as it is for most of us. We learn to make lemonade from lemons, to make a home in a place we never would have chosen, to build a network of care with people we didn't even plan to share our lives with. We learn the way of exile, of pilgrimage, of wandering, of being at home even when literal home is no longer possible. So friends, it's the second week of Lent. And this is a great time for letting go of things that are too heavy to carry. And so I invite you to loosen your white-knuckled grip on the life you had planned so that you can welcome all the derailments and difficulties that are part of this precious and beautiful gift of life that's been actually offered to you.